if you permit me, I had a little encounter with Hoyle myself, as a first-year graduate student.
Oh, really?
He came to lecture on his ideas about panspermia, and after he was done, I came alongside him, and we were walking to one of the common rooms for a post-talk reception. And I started to ask him about his view of the origin of life and the information-bearing properties of DNA. And I asked if he thought that information in the DNA molecule might be providing evidence of a designing mind. And when I said that, he looked both ways and said, he kind of went, shh. And then he said, walk with me. And then he just began to jabber. And he was very intrigued with that idea. And of course, I was in the early stages of formulating my thoughts about intelligent design and what information implied. So it was really interesting. He was a very interesting figure. But that kind of brings us, in your whole discussion of the word, the primacy of the word, both in the universe and in life, to the third big Cambridge discovery. This one happened a little before your time, but it was still, the afterglow of that was still, I'm sure, very important in the 60s with the molecular biological revolution. But in the 50s, before you came up to university, Watson and Crick, of course, elucidated the structure of the DNA molecule. In 57, Crick puts forward the famed sequence hypothesis that argues that the DNA contains information in a digital form. And you in the film talk quite a lot about the importance of information to this deep worldview question of materialism or theism, which makes more sense. And I wonder if you could talk more about that from the standpoint of the reality of information in a biological context.
Well, to step back from that, you see, as a mathematician and some kind of a scientist, what you mentioned about the rational intelligibility of the universe is central. You cannot do science without believing that. And so science doesn't give you a rational justification, except for a pragmatic one. You've got to believe it before you start. Mm-hmm. The theistic Judeo-Christian worldview gives you a rational basis for believing that, as the pioneers of science thought. Now, if you carry that a little bit further, we're saying that we can describe, at least in part, some of the phenomena in the universe by using a highly compressed language, mathematics. It's words, very carefully defined and precise words. Now, to back that up, now within the universe, not within its description, but within its very biological nature, we find, to huge surprise when it was discovered, that the longest word of any kind is actually the human genome. In other words, here we have a chemical word in 4 chemical bases, and it's 3.5 billion, roughly, letters long. And I came across this, of course, R.E.D. Clark pointed it out, and its significance. And I used to go around and visit him in Cambridge and talk to him about this. And I have never the slightest doubt that this is one of the most powerful evidences of a designing intelligence. And the more I've studied it, even though I'm not a biologist, the more powerful the evidence for that grows. Because, of course, people have attempted now for a very long time, because it was also in the 1950s that they thought they discovered how life originated. If you remember the Miller-Urey experiment, where they passed a simulated lightning discharge through a cocktail of what they thought were the chemicals in the primeval atmosphere. They produced a few amino acids and so on. But that's 70 years ago. And origin of life research, as you know better than I do, has not progressed a whit, except to demonstrate that the difficulties are infinitely greater than Miller and Urey ever imagined. So I think This is a signature.
It's quite an irony, isn't it, John, that Watson and Crick make their discovery in April of 1953, the same year as the Miller-Urey experiment. So you have this great optimism about explaining the origin of life in the very year that the discovery is made that would ultimately produce an impasse in that field, because no one's been able to explain the origin of the information that's stored in the DNA molecule.
That's right. And my summary of the whole thing, you've written a book with a superb title that I would encourage everybody to read, called The Signature in the Cell, that I would expect from my reading of the biblical material that God has left a stamp on the universe. I mentioned earlier the dignity, the value that the fact that humans are made in the image of God give to humans. But Scripture goes further. It says that there's evidence of God's existence and his power in the things that are made.
Yes.
And we perceive them. And the interesting thing is, you quoted the blind watchmaker, that biology is a study of things that give the appearance of being designed. You just have to change that very slightly. They give that appearance. That is our perception, because that is the truth. They have been designed.
Absolutely. What do you make of the career of Francis Crick? He makes this extraordinary discovery. It's a discovery for the ages, and he goes further than Watson. They elucidate together the structure of the DNA molecule, but Crick is the first to realize that DNA is literally storing information in a digital form. This is his sequence hypothesis. He suggests that the nucleotide bases are functioning like alphabetic characters or digital characters in the machine code. And yet, he maintains a staunch atheism and materialism throughout his career. He's a code breaker in World War II. He breaks the ultimate code of life, and yet doesn't seem to be able to see the significance that you and I see in it. What do you make of that?
It's very hard to second guess what thoughts go on. One of the things that I believe Crick said in early days was that he attacked the problem of the nature of DNA to prove there was no God, which is absolutely ironic, because what he discovered is very powerful evidence that there is a designing intelligence. I just do not know. I did have an encounter with Watson, which was memorable, because he gave a talk and we were walking down the stairs in my college. And I quoted Crick to him. And I said, Professor Watson, Francis Crick once said that the origin of life was like a miracle. What do you think? He was quite angry, and he said, it happened, and he turned away, and that was the end of the conversation.
Yeah.
Well, it's as if I'd hit a sore point. Why? It's strange in this world that when you raise the question of intelligent origin or God, people somehow get embarrassed. It's a bit like Thomas Nagel, although he's very different. He writes quite candidly, he doesn't want there to be a God. Well, of course, that's not a scientific position. So I don't know how to answer your question, but what I do know is that when Crick tried to explain on atheistic foundations the nature of human consciousness, he really began to talk nonsense. He wrote a book called The Astonishing Hypothesis, that you and your thoughts were simply a bundle of billions and billions of atoms and neurons and synapses. That's how he started the book. And then in the middle of the book, he said, you are essentially that. Well, of course, we know that we're composed of billions of atoms, but to say that we're only that, well, if that were true, we'd never know it, as many people have pointed out, and not only theists, but many philosophers have pointed out that we'd never know it. So I think he loses the plot when it comes to philosophy. Now, this is an important thing, and I'm sure that you can say a lot more about it than I can. Einstein once said something that lives with me and is a warning to me. The scientist is a poor philosopher. And you can see that in the writings of people like Dawkins and Hawking. They haven't a clue about philosophy. And, I'm reminded that Lord Rees, who's our astronomer royal, was asked what he thought of Hawking's views on theology and philosophy. Well, he said, I know Stephen Hawking very well. And of course, he's a brilliant cosmologist, mathematician, and physicist, no question. But he said he knows very little philosophy and no theology, and I wouldn't take seriously anything he said about that. And we come up against, Steve, what I see as power play and authority play. That is, if I am a distinguished scientist, then I can speak on any topic in the world with authority. That is not true. And I'm constantly aware of that, because here I am talking to you. I'm a pure mathematician. I'm going outside my field. Now, that's risky business. It's risky for Dawkins. It's risky for me. So what do we do? And I find the first thing to do is check with the experts in the field. And that's where I have deep criticism of people like Richard Dawkins, who will quote as evidence of historical matters a retired professor of German and no ancient historian. I mean, that is just absurd. And so it's very important that we do our homework and be modest about our conclusions, but check with the experts in the fields that we're delving into.